So Home Secretary Suella Braverman delivered a major speech in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. She was taking potshots at everything from illegal immigration to the Refugee Convention. But the thing that seems to have caused the biggest sort of media stir was her taking aim at multiculturalism. She said multiculturalism has failed. Now, Tom, I mean, the reaction to this was slightly surreal because a lot of people seem to have not actually understood what multiculturalism means.
It has. It's been quite interesting in that respect because of the fact, I mean, first of all, whenever Suella Braverman says anything, there's always this unfortunate tendency towards kind of hysteria and extreme responses. There's all kinds of rhetoric she's engaged with over the years that I've found occasionally quite unsavoury. But people catastrophize that. It was the most outrageous speech since Rivers of Blood and all this sort of stuff, which it was a right wing.
Not hate literally said that. Just
exactly. That's not me just riffing.
For the viewers.
Actually is what was said. It was a right-wing kind of immigration restrictionist speech. This is not the craziest thing that's ever happened. But you're right, one of the things that was interesting about it was the fact that the multiculturalism aspect was really latched onto, and you saw a lot of very quite personalised responses to it, which is to say, how can Suella Braverman say that multiculturalism is failed? You know, she's the descendant of Goan migrants. She's married to a Jewish gentleman. She's the Home Secretary. Rishi Sunak is our first Hindu Prime Minister, etc., etc., etc. Which you basically saw a succession of pretty experienced and pretty prominent journalists making a kind of fundamental schoolboy error in this discussion, which is to confuse living in a multiracial, multi-faith society, which again, the vast majority of people have absolutely no problem with the policy of multiculturalism, the state multiculturalism, the way in which you almost discourage integration, you celebrate difference, you fund community groups based around narrow sectional identities, you constantly kind of downgrade the sense of what brings us together and a kind of sense of shared values and missions and so on. This is a debate that's been rumbling on for decades and decades and decades, and yet they make this same kind of error, which I thought was telling insofar as you had all of these journalists bundling into a discussion which they clearly didn't know anything about. But I think was also quite depressing insofar as that used to be a much more live and kind of fruitful discussion. There is a long tradition of what I think is the most powerful critique of multiculturalism, which is a left-wing one, which is still very much pro-immigration, still very much about being internationalist and interested in people from around the world and so on, but still recognises that there is such a thing, or we should aspire to such a thing as kind of universalism and a shared sense of citizenship and all of these quite kind of basic points. It's just gone out of the window now. So when everyone only raises this question, it's like, oh, they're just against immigrants and they want everyone to, as soon as they arrive, start eating Toad in the Hole and watch Coronation Street. That's not what this discussion is about. And yet that's the boneheaded level in which a lot of people seem to want to be able to discuss it.
And Ella, I mean, what fact do you think Suella's own background, her own race plays in this? Because, you know, David Cameron came out and said multiculturalism has failed. Angela Merkel came out, you know, around 10 years ago or so. Angela Merkel before him said multiculturalism has failed, absolutely failed. Nicolas Sarkozy has said it in France. All these like quite normal centre-right politicians, technocratic politicians, if anything. And yet when Suella says it, because of who she is, because of where she comes from, it provokes this hysteria. She's not allowed to say that.
No, there is a particular kind of fetish for being obsessed with what essentially brown female politicians say. It's like that kind of crass and obvious. There is, you know, we've covered on the Spike podcast many times the sort of quite ugly kind of accusations of whether it was Sajid Javid in previous instances or other ethnic minority politicians basically not siding with the political opinion that they're supposed to hold because of their skin color, because of their religion, because of their background. I mean, that kind of, you know, Tom is exactly right. People have mixed up multiculturalism and melting pot. But the whole, and you know, the idea that we all sort of rub up together and we, you know, isn't it wonderful, which it is, that you can eat, you know, 7 different meals in a day and enjoy different cultures and dress differently and, you know, whatever, experience things from all over the world. But the whole point about multiculturalism is that it's actually it's the opposite of melting pot, because rather than us all being thrown in together and having an actually authentic process in which people, citizens of a nation, create a kind of, with all their differences, come together and form some kind of overarching universalism. What multiculturalism does is say, don't interact with other cultures because that might dilute your your
Specialness
sort
of your
authenticity,
culture,
and what we must do is, really, really focus on, and you've seen this in things like the riots in Leicester, and really focus on what makes you different rather than what brings you together. Obviously, Suella Braverman is right to say that multiculturalism has failed, but where she's completely lacking is in the Conservative Party having any sense of a shared value, any sense of, things, we could come up with it now in the back of a fag packet. It's not hard, coalescing around that. If you're a citizen of this nation, you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in tolerance, you believe in democracy. These are things that could be really powerful if articulated properly.
We'd have to deport half the editorial team at The Guardian.
Well, yeah. Neither Conservative Party nor a Labour Party have any sense of how to communicate that, which could be really quite a powerful sort of idea of what it means to be a citizen of this nation, because they are, and because however much Suella Braverman is sort of using rhetoric around this, they are scared of kind of talking about the idea of one nation with a set of values that people would come and sign up to. And I think that's the depressing thing in all of this, which is that all of the sort of panic about her discussion about multiculturalism means that we miss the actual question around immigration and the actual question around citizenship, which is what should our shared values be? What is it that Britain stands for? What is universalism? What does it mean? I want to get beyond all this kind of name calling around, childish name calling around the question of multiculturalism, and just have a better discussion about what it means to be British, what it should mean to be British. And that doesn't mean, like everyone thinks, toad in the hole and fish and chips. Let's be actually serious about this.
And
did you know, by the way, that fish and chips was not made by an English?
And next you're going to tell me that St. George was Turkish.
Yeah, he's an immigrant or whatever,
or a refugee.
Him and all the rest of us.
I'm channeling Otto English.
So Ella mentioned Leicester.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth talking a bit about where multiculturalism clearly has failed, where the failure becomes undeniable, which, I don't know, Suella's critics seem to have completely ignored.
No, exactly. I mean, that was just over a year ago now, in which you saw groups of Muslim and Hindu youths essentially having pitched battles in the streets, seemingly, again, the facts on the ground a little bit sketchy, but seemingly kind of inflamed and kind of informed by communalistic tensions on the subcontinent, kind of exporting them and kind of used, and that was kind of fueling a lot of the conflict. And there you got a kind of a pretty neat encapsulation of what we're talking about here, which is that you've got kids who were born streets away from each other in the same town, in the same country, and yet who are, for whatever reason, kind of feeling the need to engage in this kind of sectarianism between one another, to take a conflict which is, to take issues which are being fought out thousands of miles away from where they actually are, and taking that to mean something so deep within their own identity. And that's something which is, again, what it is that we're talking about. And it's something which historically, the thing about multiculturalism also, it's not just like a vibe and a mood. It's also something which is a matter of state policy, has been for a very long time. The author Kenan Malik has been always very interesting on this question about how you saw this turn towards treating minority communities as these separate kind of ethnic blocks, and the way in which that didn't just turn them against the white British mainstream, it turned them against one another. It started to break down any kind of solidarity between them, which might have been generated by a shared experience of racism, creating all kinds of sectional cultural battles. Many people have drawn a pretty direct line between various, say, Muslim organisations which were state-funded as a matter of state multicultural policy, which ended up agitating during the Rushdie protests for blasphemy to be banned and so on. So there's a straight line between state multiculturalism as a policy and a growing sectarianism amongst Britain's ethnic and minority communities. And that's something that, if you care about living in a diverse society, if we're going to use that terminology, then you should be concerned about multiculturalism, because its effect, and in many cases its intent, is to break us up into these boxes and to push us back into our respective corners. I think it's important that we don't be apocalyptic about this problem. I mean, I'm always quite struck and fascinated by the fact that I think integration in Britain has progressed. Great strides have been made almost in spite of official state multiculturalism and identity politics. I think that's a wonderful thing, and shows that people are still bristling and agitating against those divisions which are being artificially created between us. But at the same time, it is a problem. You do need to be able to talk about it. And as we've already sort of been touching on, I think those people on the more liberal end of the migration discussion, it's particularly essential if you want to maintain and build support for a liberal migration policy, to have this sense of universal values and integration at the core of it, definitely.
It's also a problem. It's a big problem for immigrants as well, because obviously, historically, you had things like, all Irish people living in Finsbury Park or Kilburn, or, but different ethnic minorities or groups of immigrants coalescing and finding solace in, sticking together because there were issues of racism and, problems with integrating. But obviously that is not solved by saying, okay, stick to your area, stay in your little safe space and don't let anyone else encroach on it, or don't engage with anyone, which is what multiculturalism is basically institutionalizing the idea that you should have siloed sort of not echo chambers, but actually physical spaces where you sort of stay separate from people. And I can tell you that, that's not what immigrants want. They don't want to come to live in a different country, to start a life somewhere, and it be exactly the same as where they came from, or have no relationships. And by the way, it actually doesn't happen a lot of the time. But where it does happen is that there is, because tensions rise about division, and because people feel that there is this sort of pressure on them to not tiptoe around each other and not actually authentically engage with each other, the problem just deepens. So if you care about, fighting back against racism, or you care about genuine integration, then you can't go along with this idea that sort of it's almost sort of like a separate but equal kind of, it's terrible. It's harking back to actually what old school racists used to suggest happen. You stay on that side of the block, I'll stay on this side, and never to the twain shall meet.
And in a weird sort of way as well, I think you see a reflection of the whole ideology in the treatment of people like Braverman and Patel. It's this idea you're a homogenous group of people, you have certain views, you have certain values. It's outrageous when you step out of your life. I have to say that, as you say, the kind of hair trigger response to a Priti Patel or a Suella Braverman when they come out and say something mildly critical of immigration or multiculturalism or whatever is strange on one side, because it's the idea that, if you know any ethnic minority people, of course there's a divergence of views. No one is this homogenous block. But it's also, it has such a ring to it of almost like the old-fashioned racist who has a go at the ethnic minority politician because they're ungrateful or something that, how dare you talk about multiculturalism given you've so wonderfully benefited from it. That there's a really nasty undertone to all of that, which I think we can't let escape us, definitely.